Welcome back, everyone. So in this series of videos, I've been talking about the relationship between the doctrine of eternal torment and prophecy, and how it's my belief that any comprehensive view concerning the final state of the wicked really requires that we understand that doctrine within a much wider eschatological context. So a couple of weeks ago, I uploaded an introduction video, and in that video, I gave a couple brief examples of how our understanding of Bible prophecy and eschatology will necessarily influence our views concerning the final state of the lost. So if you've not watched that video yet, I will put a link in the description. But today, I need to get down into the weeds a little bit. And so what I hope to do in this video is get specific and show how one's understanding of prophecy can really affect the interpretation of some verses which have generally been applied to the doctrine of eternal torment, and how the opposite is also true, how what we think about hell can really influence our understanding of Bible prophecy. And I hope to show just how intertwined these two doctrines are. What I'd like to do is illustrate just how this interplay between the doctrine of eternal torment and prophecy has led to two divergent and completely opposing paradigms through which Christians have read Scripture. So this video might be a little bit of a detour, but I think it's important because it highlights some of the issues we're up against when trying to properly interpret some of these passages, which have typically been applied to the doctrine of eternal torment. So you might remember in the last video how I pointed out how Jesus' warning to the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23:33, his warning of the judgment of Gehenna, or as our English Bibles usually say, the damnation of hell, when compared with Jeremiah chapter 19, is strong evidence that when Jesus warned of this, quote, judgment of Gehenna, he wasn't warning about a place of eternal torment in the afterlife, but of an impending cataclysm which was about to befall the Jewish nation. It was in that very place, the valley of the sons of Hinnom, or Gehenna, that Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 19, warned the Jewish leaders of his time that the entire nation was about to be desolated, and that there would be a great slaughter of the Jewish people, and that slaughter would be so great that they would bury corpses in the valley of Hinnom or Gehenna until there was no place left to bury them. And in the same way, Jesus warned the scribes and Pharisees, the Jewish leaders of his day, that they would not escape the judgment of Gehenna, and that their house was left to them, quote, desolate. Now, it's a historical fact that within 40 years of Jesus' warning to the Jewish leaders, that the Jewish nation did experience such a cataclysmic desolation and destruction at the hands of the Romans. In 70 A.D., the Romans completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem, including the temple. So I'm not sure that a lot of Christians understand the significance of that event. With the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and along with the temple sacrifice and ordinances, the entire fabric of the Old Covenant was swept away. And the absolute horror of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the nation was graphically documented by the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in his work War of the Jews. Now, I won't go into a great amount of detail in this video, but anyone who takes the time to read Josephus's account of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, they cannot help but be struck by the similarity between the warning of judgment given by Jeremiah, the judgment of Gehenna, and what the Jewish people suffered at the hands of the Romans in 70 A.D. And I will put a link in the description to Josephus's works for anyone who's curious. So, keeping in mind the parallel between Jeremiah's warning of a coming cataclysmic destruction that he gave to the leaders of his time, with Jesus' warning of the judgment of Gehenna to the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 33, it's hard to see how this destruction of the nation at the hands of the Romans in 70 A.D. could not have been a fulfillment of Jesus' warning of the judgment of Gehenna. Now, I'd like you to consider for a moment how the standard interpretation of Matthew 23:33, as understood by most Christians, completely ignores this historical context. Are we really supposed to believe that Jesus' warning of the judgment of Gehenna has absolutely nothing to do with the destruction of the entire nation in the first century? By simply translating Gehenna, or the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom, as hell, the entire prophetic and historical context of Jesus' warning is lost on most Christians. Jeremiah 19 contains a warning of the judgment of Gehenna, which would desolate the nation. Jesus warned of the judgment of Gehenna, which would desolate the nation. And the Romans destroyed and desolated the Jewish nation in 70 AD. To say that Gehenna just is hell is to ignore all of this. And to my mind, at least, any interpretation that does that just cannot be correct. Now, someone might be tempted to dismiss any connection between Jesus' warning of the judgment of Gehenna with Jeremiah's by pointing out that the warning of Jeremiah 19 was fulfilled when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and took the Jewish people into captivity in 597-598 BC. Someone might reason that Jesus is warning of a greater fulfillment of the judgment of Gehenna. And with that conclusion, I would agree. But why think that any greater fulfillment of Gehenna should be hell, or a place of eternal torment in the afterlife? Sure, Jesus' words have a greater fulfillment, but certainly not one of a different kind or nature which would be completely foreign to the context of both Jeremiah 19 and Matthew chapter 23. And indeed, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD was a greater fulfillment than that of the Babylonian destruction of the 6th century BC. Whereas the desolation and captivity of the Babylonians lasted 70 years, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in the 1st century led to a desolation from which the nation would never recover. Now, here's where things begin to get a little tricky. If we conclude that Jesus' warning of the judgment of Gehenna in Matthew 23:33 was fulfilled by the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the nation in 70 AD, then one might ask, is that all Jesus had in mind when he spoke of Gehenna? Jesus used the word Gehenna 11 times in the Gospel. Should we conclude that in every place he used that word, he was referring to the same 1st century national cataclysm? And it's the attempt to answer that question that makes things a little more difficult than they might at first appear. In fact, the way some answer that question has led to two fully opposing prophetic paradigms or schools of thought. And whichever of those paradigms we deem to be correct is going to strongly influence how we read other hell verses in Scripture, as well as how we interpret nearly all Bible prophecy. Now, to show how this is, let's look at another passage in which Jesus spoke of Gehenna, and this one is from Mark chapter 9. Jesus used the word Gehenna, again translated hell in our English Bibles, 3 times in Mark 9 alone, in verses 43 to 48, and in each of those cases he describes Gehenna as a place where, quote, the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now, as I pointed out in my last video, many Christians, based on the translation of Gehenna as hell in our Bibles, assume that Jesus is describing a place of eternal torment in the afterlife. But Jesus is here actually quoting the last verse of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 66:24, which reads, quote, and they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. Now, this is not an image of anybody burning in hell in the afterlife. On the contrary, Isaiah 66:24 makes clear that the undying worms and unquenchable fire is here devouring carcasses, literally dead bodies. And I will just note here that the Hebrew word here for carcasses is pager. And in the Hebrew scriptures, pager never means anything other than a literal dead body, a corpse. So what's important to notice here is how this compares again with that same imagery from Jeremiah 19, that a cataclysm would befall the Jewish nation in which they would bury corpses in Gehenna until there was no place left to bury. And Jesus described Gehenna using this well-known phrase from the book of Isaiah, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And in Isaiah, it is again describing a place for the disposal of dead bodies following a great slaughter. Now, Remember what I've said about wider prophetic context. So it seems almost certain that Jesus' warning of the damnation of hell or judgment of Gehenna can be connected to Jeremiah 19. But here in Mark 9, it appears that Jesus also associated Gehenna with this passage from the book of Isaiah. And when we begin to consider this passage, Isaiah 66:24, in its wider context, well, that's when we begin to run headlong into some issues. So let's look at the context of this passage in Isaiah. And I think what I mean about trying to understand these hell passages in their wider prophetic context will become clearer. Starting in Isaiah 66:22, we read, "For as the new heavens and new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh." So notice here the context in which the phrase, "their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched," a phrase which Jesus applied to Gehenna, or hell, appears. When does this appear to be taking place? Well, in verse 22 we read, "For as the new heavens and new earth which I shall make shall remain before me." Do you see what the issue is here? The context of the phrase, "their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched," here in Isaiah 66, appears to be associated with the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. And the creation of the new heavens and the new earth is something that we find all the way at the very end of the Bible, at the end of the book of Revelation, a time period that's generally associated with events still future, which happen only after Jesus' second coming. So while a comparison of Jesus' warning of the judgment of Gehenna with Jeremiah 19 appears to have been fulfilled in the 1st century AD when the Romans destroyed the nation, a comparison of Jesus' words in the book of Mark, along with its parallel in the book of Isaiah, appears to place the fulfillment in a much different and still future context. If Gehenna is the place where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, but that figure applies to the creation of a new heaven and new earth, then can we really say that the 1st century destruction of Jerusalem is all Jesus had in mind when he spoke of Gehenna? Wouldn't that at least appear to weaken and undermine an exclusively 1st century application of Gehenna? So notice how the connection in Isaiah between Gehenna as a place where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, along with Jesus' quotation of that verse, how this forms a perfectly logical chain of inference, implying that Jesus' use of Gehenna may await a future fulfillment in that context, a future that will not take place until after the Last Judgment. The logic would go something like this. In Mark 9, the judgment of Gehenna is described by the words, "where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched." According to Isaiah, that judgment is in the context of the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. And according to Revelation chapter 20, the creation of the new heavens and the new earth awaits a future fulfillment. Therefore, we could conclude that the judgment of Gehenna, of which Jesus was speaking, also awaits a future fulfillment. Now, this seems to be a perfectly logical chain of inference, and this is one that I've seen proposed several times. It's reason that whatever Gehenna may be, it simply cannot be strictly defined by any reference to historical events, because it's clear, at least to those who hold this view, that Gehenna represents a punishment which still awaits a future fulfillment, and that any earthly judgment which may have been represented by this place is only a shadow of its greater future reality, that is, hell, in the minds of many. Now, the trouble is that while to some all of this may seem perfectly logical, and it is logical, the problem is it's not the only logical inference which can be drawn from the exact same set of facts. So let me illustrate. Consider the following argument, which shows just how easily one might arrive at an entirely divergent and opposite conclusion, depending how we view the prophetic context of these verses. So an equally logical argument might go something like this. First, the judgment of Gehenna warned of by Jesus in Matthew 23:33 is to be equated with Jeremiah's warnings in Jeremiah 19. Second, Jeremiah's and thus Jesus' warnings of the judgment of Gehenna were precisely fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the Romans completely destroyed the temple, city, and nation, thus ending the whole system under the Old Covenant. We could then reason that this must be the same judgment represented by Jesus' words in Mark 9 and Isaiah's words in Isaiah 66, describing Gehenna as the place where, quote, the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. We would conclude that those verses also must have been fulfilled in the first century. Then, noticing this judgment, the one where the worms and unquenchable fire devour the corpses of the wicked, is, according to Isaiah, associated with the creation of the new heavens and new earth, we would then conclude that the creation of the new heavens and the new earth also must have been fulfilled in the first century. Now, many Christians might find a conclusion like this fanciful, if not impossible, but I can tell you that a growing number of believers interpret these passages exactly as I've just presented them. While we might not like or agree with this conclusion, there is no denying that it's the result of logical inference. Now, whether we like to admit it or not, both of these trains of thought that I've just presented, whether the judgment of Gehenna is in fact a past event or a future event, both of these represent perfectly logical conclusions which may be drawn from the exact same set of facts. And it's precisely for reasons such as this that entirely divergent prophetic frameworks have emerged. In simply trying to deal with passages which have traditionally been advanced to teach the doctrine of eternal torment, we find ourselves trying to navigate this much more complex prophetic landscape. Now, any comprehensive examination of the scriptural doctrine concerning the final state of the wicked is not going to be able to ignore these issues. So the two chains of reasoning I've presented here are both logical. The question is which, if either of them, is actually correct. Or perhaps they've both overlooked something. And quick spoiler alert here, I believe they probably have. And that's my goal in this series of videos, to show how any discussion of man's ultimate destiny is sooner or later going to run headlong into the issues of how prophecy in general needs to be interpreted. I've seen these issues arise time and time again in online discussions. And it also shows why a detailed study of eschatology and prophecy is important. Ultimately, it affects our view of nearly every other biblical doctrine. So these two views I've presented fall roughly into two wholly divergent schools of prophetic thought. One is called futurism, which, as the name suggests, sees much of Bible prophecy as awaiting a future fulfillment. And the other is called full preterism, or sometimes hyper-preterism. And it's a system which sees all or nearly all Bible prophecy as having been fulfilled before or within the historical events culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the question is whether or not either of these views can offer a comprehensive and scripturally harmonious view concerning the ultimate fate of the unsaved once all the prophetic data is considered. And to be frank, I don't think they can. So if neither of these views is sufficient to understand all of the data about the final state of the lost within a wider prophetic context, then what kind of framework will work? So in future videos, that's exactly what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to present a prophetic framework that I feel better understands all of the biblical data, both prophetic and the data surrounding passages concerning the final state of the wicked. But specifics will have to wait for another time. So that's going to be all for today. I really appreciate you all taking the time to watch. But for now, I'm David with the Harvest Herald, and I'll talk to you all again real soon in the next video.